One of the things that you'll run into if you spend any serious time reading about UFOs is something that ufologists call the contactee movement or contactee literature. These are people's stories when they claim to have been abducted by aliens or they claim to have met alien beings. And what's interesting to me as a theologian and as a biblical scholar is the messaging. There are a number of people in the field, they would attribute it to very human causes and brainwashing techniques. Okay? People abused in various ways and various reasons and given screen memories, something to remember in place of this. Again, this is a very weird, vast field that has deep roots in some very esoteric subjects that sound like they can't be real, okay, like mind control, MKUltra. To me, it's not a coincidence that the same people who are in the paperwork at the congressional hearing on MKUltra in the 70s, their names show up in alien abduction narratives. This was a program that grew out of CIA and a few other government agency efforts to produce drugs for different purposes. It really began in the pursuit of a truth serum, believe it or not. In the 50s, there was a lot of effort put into, can we come up with a drug that forces people to tell the truth? And if we can do that, can we use that and take that drug and experiment on our own people to build up a resistance in case they're ever captured? Well, part of that research, people discovered that when you traumatize an individual, the natural coping mechanism of the brain will dissociate. And we all experience dissociation in our own lives in very minor ways. You're driving down the road, it's a fairly long trip, you get to your destination, you can't quite remember how you got there, but you know you're there. Okay, your mind went somewhere else. Well, the people in this program discovered that you could deliberately do this to people and have part of their mind essentially split off. And then it was ready for programming. You could give it instructions. This used to be called multiple personality disorder. It could either be done deliberately in a lab, or it's what the brain did when the person was like ritually abused or repeatedly abused, all sorts of different contexts. The government decided to explore this area of research, and one of the programs that did that was known as MKUltra. If you've ever seen the movie Conspiracy Theory with Mel Gibson, he is an MKUltra victim in the movie. Manchurian Candidate. That is classic MKUltra mind manipulation, mind transformation, and programming. It's a big theme in a lot of movies. And it was discovered to be in existence and explored by Congress in the 70s. Most of the evidence for it was destroyed prior to the church hearings. That's what the hearings were called, but someone found 18 or 20 boxes that they had missed, and that's why we know about it. There are some very key names that show up in that literature, that set of hearings, and alien abduction research or events. And I don't think that's a coincidence. So when I look at the subject, I think it's wicked. I think it's evil. I think people are deliberately abused in half a dozen different contexts. And this is the outcome. John Mack at Harvard, he compared it to shamanistic experiences. And we might even think of something like the Stockholm Syndrome, when you begin to identify with your captors and you feel special, you're chosen, even though this was awful. They did it for a good reason. And I'm now their messenger, and this is where you get messaging. You have a message now to give to humankind about the world's destiny, about what we need to do to evolve. I think it's deeply sinister. I think some of it could actually be overtly demonic. In other words, the mechanism that produces this set of memories can be different. I personally have two friends who focus on abduction research. They've documented over 100 cases where they will either lead someone to Christ or train a person to make it a spiritual confrontation when whatever is happening to them happens. And they have been delivered from repeated abduction experiences. In other words, they stop. If that's successful, to me that says there's some inherent spiritual element to this particular thing within this big umbrella world we call UFO stuff. But since it's inherently spiritual and it's evil and it's wicked, a lot of UFO researchers are the enemies of the whole subject. They think it's contrived or they think it's abusive. They don't think it has anything to do with aliens at all. I think ultimately, if this is the content of the messaging, it's so directed, again, in anti-Christian or subversion of Christian theology that it's very easy for me to think of it in terms of a deception by, again, a superior intelligence, but not one that comes from another planet. We're talking about a sinister intelligence from the spiritual world, the kind of unseen realm that the Bible talks about. And we would use the word demons, demonic, for that sort of thing. It's actually much wider than that. Again, my specialty is the unseen realm, and that realm is a lot bigger than just angels and demons. But for the sake of talking about the messaging, it's really dark. It's no exaggeration to say that the messaging that people supposedly get from aliens is inherently anti-Christian. And what I mean by that is Jesus is nothing special. He's a human that we selected to communicate to other people, or he's one of us. And it really doesn't do that to other religions. And that might sound like an unsubstantiated claim, but I can say it because I have read the contactee literature. If you've ever seen the movie Close Encounters of the Third Kind, one of the characters in that movie, the French ufologist, is modeled after someone real, Jacques Vallée, who's a very famous figure in UFO studies. He's a computer science PhD, that was his real vocation. But Vallée, who is not a Christian, was one of the earliest people to say and to write for this audience that there is something spiritually sinister about this alien contact messaging. So it's not just me. There are non-believers, non-Christians who have noticed the same thing. There was actually a big conference in 1992 held at MIT, yes, that MIT, on alien abductions. And part of it was because there was a famous professor at Harvard, the psychology department, he was a psychiatrist himself, who was heavily into alien abduction research. His name was John Mack. He's no longer living. At that event, and it was held over a few days, there were a number of scholars who decided to tackle this subject. You can buy the papers, they were all published, and one of them was on what are the similarities between abduction narratives and satanic ritual abuse. Good topic. For people that are unfamiliar with that term, we are actually talking about ritual activity, worship, so to speak, in a Luciferian context that involves sexual abuse and other kinds of abuse. There are touch points between what people say that happened to them in these rituals or what the goal of an abduction experience was supposedly. There are lots of parallels, and we're not talking 3 or 4. I've actually counted them. There are over 20. The metal tables, the types of wounds that people suffer, they're probed in all sorts of awful places. Messaging about we're doing this so that you can birth a hybrid child. Now, the kinds of things you would hear in a satanic ritual abuse situation or any sort of deliberate trauma episode that sort of linked itself to Lucifer or Satan would be, for instance, with children, where children are being sexually abused and the perpetrator might pass themselves off, even in costume, as Jesus, for instance. And so the whole notion is to get the child convinced that God hates them, or that Lucifer is the real God and Jesus is their enemy. With adults, again, it takes on a different sort of flavor, although the messaging can be sort of the same. It can be a little more sophisticated. For instance, messaging that would be consistent with you're special, you're chosen. But there's sometimes this spin put on it that even though this is suffering, it's the shamanistic sort of approach, that this event will help tune you in more to the realities of the spiritual world, and that will prep you to take a message that people need to hear. Now, in terms of alien abduction narrative, this is very common. You'll often have women, for instance, who are convinced that they are carrying, as a result of their abduction experience, a child that is essentially a hybrid, that might either be termed the Antichrist, or there will be things or ways it's talked about that sort of would remind a Christian of how the Antichrist is described, or sort of beast imagery from the book of Revelation, that sort of thing. But it's cast in a positive spin. In other words, this child is sort of a divine, human interface or hybrid that is going to be here not to do bad things, but to help humanity realize what it could become. You might wonder what connection this sort of thing has to satanic ritual abuse. Sometimes there is a connection, sometimes there's not. Again, people have these experiences and relate narratives, memories, for different reasons. It really, again, in my view, since I don't think that aliens are behind this at all, but I think most cases, the overwhelming number of cases, humans are behind these things. It just depends on what messaging people are given. Sort of what thing do we want you to remember that you will slide that in as your experience, which will hide and obscure and deny what really happened to you. But when the messaging is so dark, and what's done to people, or what people think was done to them, is so sinister, again, that has a very evil feel to it. I do leave the door open, though, to something that I would call direct demonization, where people have an experience where there is some sort of spiritual event, something done to them by a spiritual being, and then this is the way they process it, or the way they could process it. In my mind, the ones that stand out as sort of pretty well, probably, obviously, getting into that territory, demonic in nature, are the ones that really sort of have a reaction to a person who is taught or remembers to sort of interject Jesus into the conversation. When you have something going on and you invoke the name of Christ, for instance, or you speak to the perpetrator in the name of Christ and demand that they stop, or something like that. And again, there are hundreds of these sorts of cases where a victim does this deliberately, intentionally, and not only does the incident stop, but it never repeats. That tells me that there's a demonic element, a pretty clear demonic element to what's going on. Abductions often run in families, abduction experiences. Again, these what we're calling alien abduction experiences. They either run in families or they repeat with particular people, quite frequently. It comes back again and again and again and again. And again, we're familiar with that too because of media, movies and television shows. So when you have that kind of situation and you address it with sort of a spiritual weapon, and then it's done, to me that suggests pretty strongly that we had a supernatural event going on here. In terms of specific examples as far as contactee messaging that I would view as sinister, something that is spiritual darkness, lurking in the background. In the history of ufology, there have been a couple of very famous contactee episodes. One of them involved a guy named George Adamski. Adamski became very famous in the 50s, and thereafter for supposedly being contacted by an alien presence, visiting Venus and all these different planets, having this or that vision. I call them visions, but he would actually say he went to these places with his alien friends. And his messaging was really nothing more than warmed over Gnosticism, that the aliens were telling him, oh, every human has the light of God, or the light of the supernatural realm in them, and they just need to remember sort of who they are. They need to be enlightened. Very typical Gnostic messaging about the salvation of humanity being from within and recognizing their own divinity.